Hi, it's Victor Perton here from the Centre for Optimism, and today I welcome Rebecca Houghton, the author of Impact, 10 Ways to Level Up Your Leadership. It's a great read, and some of my favourite passages from the book. We need to legitimise doubt without sucking the optimism from the room. And then, really crucial, learn to be an optimist. Your brain is wired for negativity like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. Rewire it by noticing your negativity and search for a silver lining in the situation. Even if it's unintended, good things often come out of even the most difficult situations. Rebecca Houghton, welcome to the Centre for Optimism and the Australian Leadership Project. So look, Rebecca, at the Centre for Optimism, we often say the leader looks like the person in your mirror, that leadership is for everyone. So you're the first person I know to write a book for the B-suite. Why do it?
Great question, Victor. So the B-suite for me, I remember, coming up as a leader myself and leaving leadership twice in my career because I really didn't enjoy it. And it really got to that point for me where this middle manager that's been so maligned for 30 years, right? This middle manager role almost felt thankless, it felt worthless, it felt low value. The branding of being a bureaucrat and a middle manager and a pencil pusher really irked me, because mid-level leaders pull it all together. They are the ones translating what the executive want with what the workforce will do, and creating, communication and flow. And really, I began to feel quite personal about the mission of bringing the mid-level leader back into the center of the organization, which is really where they live and ultimately where I felt they belonged. So that's really what the B-suite is to me, is it's a complete reinvention of how we look at mid-level leaders and the value that we apply to them.
Well, I think the book is brilliant, and I loved reading it. And I've already shared with our audience, some of the quotes that I really love. But what's changing? We've had the pandemic, we're in the 2020s. What's changing that leaders need to change their approach?
Yeah, gosh, the last 3 years, it has changed every single year, right? So we've gone through survival, where the leader is the hero and kind of follow me and we're going to be okay in the trenches. We've gone through a year, particularly in Australia, of almost waiting. 2021 was a year of just waiting for COVID to go away, waiting for the world to go back to normal, or to create a new normal. And next year is going to be different again. Next year is going to be a third way of working. It's not going to be working from home. It's not going to be working in the office. This hybrid approach is not really a bit of that and a bit of the other. It's something completely new. And what we know is that the workforce has been disconnected for 2 years nearly. And we've never done that before in the history of work. We have never been this disconnected. And this has a pretty profound effect on the psyche of your team. And as leaders, we've got to really lean into that and bring people back together, reconnect that disconnect. And that's going to mean a whole new set of skills for us. And at a time when really these C-suite leaders are feeling exhausted and burned out and disconnected themselves.
So you do a lot of coaching work, you live in, one of the most interesting cities in the world in terms of this changing workforce, robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So what do you see in that Australian milieu? What do Australians want from their leaders?
Oh, such a good question, Victor. It's actually quite interesting how different Australia is to the rest of the world. So some of the bad news, our burnout rate is higher here in this country than anywhere else on the planet. B-suite leadership burnout rate is much higher here than anywhere else on the planet. We're not, as a nation, we're not quite as threat fit as some other nations are, right? We haven't really had very many threats on this island in the last 80 years. So we're not very familiar with the sensation of being threatened and being nervous and being anxious on an ongoing basis. So I think what Australians really want from their leaders is a genuine personal connection, a sense that they're not alone in feeling anxious, and a sense that we will together find a way forward. You know, one of the beautiful things about Australians is what a very strong team culture we have here, much stronger than in some other, you know, nations. So this sense of bringing the team back and bringing, you know, putting team back into the team is going to be really, really vital and quite exciting in terms of what it means for us as leaders next year.
Last year we did a wonderful series called The Optimist Heart, and it was a Sunday morning program and focused on heartfelt optimism and, you know, elements of spirituality and the like. One of the things that Caroline Ward caught up with me last week and reminded me that, you know, when I started my mission around this, you know, there's the personal case for optimism, you know, better health, better sleep, better relationships, better leadership. And for the organization or the country to be able to harness that optimism is a different thing. So in your work around the B-suite and you know, with Australian leaders, how can an organization support the sort of changes you're advocating? So, you know, on the one hand, you know, as the Dalai Lama would say, we're the only ones who can make meaning of our work. The boss has no influence on whether I get meaning from my work, or very little influence. But how might an organization, you know, take up what you've talked about in impact? And then, as you say, to help rewire the organization for positivity rather than negativity?
That's a good question. Organizations are trapped in this shift from the 80s sort of model of hierarchy and moving towards a much more democratic approach to managing their business. And as with any major shift, they're going through a painful growth phase. And that's really what's happening right now. So right now you've got this massive shift between Y and X management philosophies. You've got a massive shift between holding power and empowering people. You've got a massive shift between command and control and genuine accountability and autonomy. And at the moment, you've almost got the two things living in the one organization. And that's pretty tiring for a workforce to follow that because it's confusing. But we've got to go through that in order to come out of the other side and be more, be less autocratic, more democratic. And I think that really, for me, is the fundament of it, is to understand that to be a more powerful organization, individuals in the organization have to give their power away. And that's very hard for individual people to do. But once they get over that, we will achieve a great deal more together.
My impression of your writing and your work is you really get that Australian leadership and what's different about Australian leadership and global leadership. You know, in our research at in the Australian Leadership Project, you know, we interviewed 2,500 people. We talked to INSEAD and Harvard and the like, and the three qualities of Australian leadership that we hit upon that differentiate Australians from global leaders is egalitarianism. You know, Australians are off the Richter scale for talking to the cleaner with the same respect as the chairman. You know, where the Prime Minister has to sit in the front seat of the limousine, not the back seat. Self-effacing humour, which you exemplified. You know, that laughter, that ability to laugh at ourselves, and then that plain speaking, you know, for which we're mocked, you know, in some parts of Asia. But on the other hand, you know, when you look at the stereotype of us everywhere from Brazil to the US to France, they love that, you know, you never die wondering what an Australian's thinking. Have we picked up the traits of Australian leadership, or is there something else that you'd see there too?
No, I think that actually, you're making me smile because you couldn't have described an Australian leader better. You know, the straight shooting, I love, the self-effacing, like doesn't take themselves too seriously. And for many Australian leaders, leadership is a privilege, a calling. It's just part of the gig. You know, it's not something that marks them out as different or special. You know, it's just another job. And that's actually quite refreshing because you look at Europe and this sense of hierarchy and entitlement and seniority and superiority that goes with being a leader. And I think here, of all countries, this sense of a leader as servant or leader as coach has, you know, it's very fertile ground for concepts like that, because here in this country, we've never really come at it with this leader as God mentality. So I feel very optimistic about Australian leaders really leading the way in terms of really democratizing workforces.
Yeah, no, and in fact, you put that really well. One of the interesting things that I have found is that when you ask an Australian about leadership, they think of the Prime Minister, they think of the Queen, they don't think of the person in the corner suite in their building.
That's right.
And so oftentimes I use the word boss rather than leader, because whilst boss is a pejorative in some countries, I think in Australia it's an affectionate term, you know, for your manager or your, you know, the person you directly report to. So can I ask you, thinking about the leaders and the bosses in your own life, who've been the ones who've inspired you?
When I first came to Australia, I lost my mojo. You know, I couldn't make it work here the same way that I made it work back in the UK. This is 20 odd years ago now. And my first brilliant boss was a lady who kind of picked me up and dusted me off and just said, stop beating yourself up, just give it one more shot. And if it doesn't work, I'll send you back to England myself. And she was perfect because she gave me that last shot of confidence that I needed to give it a go. And then she got out of my way. And to this day, she is the leader that I hold up as being what I'd like to be when I grow up.
Are you going to name her for us?
Yes, absolutely. Rona McLean. She's up in Brisbane, and she's fabulous. Just an amazing leader and person.
Well, a big shout out to you, Rona, and we'll send you this video as well. So we need to do that. And then look, you know, your book, you know, just has optimism smeared throughout it. You know, it says, you know, to be a good boss, you need to be optimistic, and infectiously optimistic. And, you know, as Dominic Barton, who was the head of McKinsey and now the Canadian ambassador to China, said to me, that the great leader is not the person who makes the grand speech from the podium. It's the one who can unlock the optimism in the team. And, you know, that's one of the bits of advice you give. But may I ask you, as we head towards 2022, you know, and your own passions, what makes you optimistic, Rebecca?
Oh, such a great question. You know, I think the last couple of years have been really tough, right? And no one would argue with that anywhere in the world. The last couple of years have been really tough. But when you take a big step back and zoom out, it is the most fascinating period to be alive. I mean, really, the last time we saw anything this momentous was the two great world wars. This is, you know, this is the time of your life. And people will be studying this era for hundreds of years. And you're right here and you're living it. And yes, that means it's hard, but my God, I wouldn't want it, you know, I wouldn't want it boring. And it certainly hasn't been that. And I don't think it will be for another 2 years. You know, I think we've got a 5-year run of this major disruption that we're halfway through. But the optimism is we've done worse before. We've done it tougher before. We always pull through. We always improve. So for me, it's like, what a privilege to be living planet-changing era. And I'm very confident that we will come out of it bigger and stronger and better, because that's how we roll, us humans. That is our gig. It's what we do.
It's we are the descendants of the optimists.
Yeah, well, I don't think we'd still be on this planet if we weren't.
So let me just refer you to a couple of my favorite passages in your book that I opened this conversation with. One of our board members is John Hagel, you know, the former head of the Deloitte Centre for the Edge, who wrote the book, The Power of Pull, but more recently, The Journey Beyond Fear. And one of his pillars is the passion of the explorer. You know, that curiosity, you know, is the key to 2020's leadership. And one of the passages from your book, and I'll read it directly, is we need to legitimize doubt without sucking the optimism from the room. I love that. I mean, just such a beautiful piece of writing. Do you want to elaborate on that, how we can make that happen?
Yes. I think there is this sense, isn't there, that optimism is blind optimism, that it's naive optimism, that it's, you know, lacking planning, lacking risk management, lacking governance. And I really think actually it's the complete opposite. You know, people used to argue about, is it realism or is it optimism? I'm sure you've anchored that argument a few times. Yeah. So for me, I think the optimist, or the good quality optimist, is somewhat of a realist, which does mean that to be optimistic, you have to go through all the negativity in order to be more confident than ever that it's going to be okay. If you didn't do that, that would be blind optimism, right? That would be bad planning. That would be unfounded positivism, which can sometimes mean that you end up in a big hole. And I'm more of the realism flavor of optimism. So for me, actually being able to air your doubts as a team, to go through what I love to use as a pre-mortem, you sit there and you go, okay, this all goes wrong and we're in the press. What does it say? And to catastrophize the plan really makes for a better plan, which means that you're more likely to succeed. So for me, I think harnessing doubt is part of building optimism.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I mean, when we do presentations, or when I do presentations, I often quote Mother Julian of Norwich, who lived in the 14th century in the last Great Plague, which killed 30% of the British population and who knows elsewhere. And in her book, The Revelations, she says, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And that's translated to the contemporary definition of optimism, a la Harvard and Oxford and Stanford, which is a belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end. But it doesn't say that there's a silver lining in every dark cloud and bad things don't happen to good people. We all go through our grief. We will always have death in our family, in our colleagues and business struggles. So I think you absolutely nail it. Although, interesting enough, I'm thinking of an event next year which we're going to hold called In Defense of Pollyanna. Because recently a chairman of a company said to me, she said, I am a Pollyanna. I only spend my time doing the things that will benefit mankind. So I'm going to do an event too, but realistic optimism, when you look at the science on health and optimism and the like, particularly the Monash study that was published this year and the American Heart Association, it's as you say, realistic optimism is the key. Now, look, I'd like to throw another, my second favorite passage from your book, which is learn to be an optimist. And you say your brain is wired for negativity like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. And you quote Hansen. And then rewire it by noticing your negativity and search for a silver lining in the situation, even if it's unintended. Good things often come out of even the most difficult situations. And then I love this challenge you give your readers. How might you finish this sentence? The one good thing about all this is. So I'm going to throw that question to you. This last 2 years of struggle, living in the city with the longest lockdown in the world, the one good thing about this is?
So many, Victor, so many. So on a personal level, the one good thing has been my connection with my sons. Having been an executive that worked 7 till 7 in the office, I honestly didn't really see them. I was kind of outsourcing their upraising. So that has totally transformed and I would never go back. So that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. From a work perspective, the flexibility argument that's been loitering and bubbling, but not really achieving anything for a decade, just suddenly had to happen. And now that will never get put back in its box either. And these are brilliant steps forward, brilliant. So I think there's lots. There's actually a huge list. Those are my 2 big ones.
Well, Rebecca Houghton, this has been fantastic. You filled my cup, both, for the Centre for Optimism and the Australian Leadership Project. I strongly recommend your book, to anyone. It's a great read. You've got this infectiously optimistic leadership of your own. Rebecca Houghton, thank you so much for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure, Victor. Thank you for having me here.